Hello class. Well, this recording is on Chapter 7 of the ER book, the new ER book, and this is the chapter on the weak entity. The weak entity is a very important concept, and so we really need to understand this well. Well, so far we kept on referring to the term entity. The term entity generally, when we don't have a prefix attached to it, and we just say entity, we generally mean the strong entity. So when we talked about, in the last set of slides, for example, an employee entity or a department entity, we generally meant a strong entity. Okay. When we mean a strong a weak entity, we say so. Now, in this set of slides, or rather to describe this chapter, I'm not going to follow the slides slide by slide. I'm going to also have you go and pick up your book. So I'll give you a moment to go and pick up your book at this point. Okay, now that you have your book, I'll move on maybe a couple slides, and then I'll talk about the book also. Obviously, in your book, open up to Chapter 7, the weak entity. Okay, so as a review, I'm on slide 4. Entities are things about which we store data. Strong entities are entities that are identifiable, that have identifiable fields or groups of fields that represent the key. Basically, a strong entity is an entity that stands on its own, that can stand on its own, that has a primary key, that can be identified on its own and does not need another entity to help identify it. That's what a strong entity is. A weak entity, on the other hand, if you look at the slide right now, the weak entity does not have a unique identifier or a key. A weak entity basically is defined as an entity that depends on the strong entity for its existence. So if the strong entity that it depends on did not exist, the weak entity would not exist. And the classic example of this is the employee-dependent relationship. So if you turn in your book to, let's directly turn to page 175 in your book, you will find an employee, which is a strong entity, because the employee ID has an underline on it, and the underline is a full underline. The dependent is a weak entity, and the dependent entity, you'll notice that the dependent has a partial key, which is what we call the primary key for the weak entity, a partial key, which is dot underlined. So D name is dash underlined or dot underlined, however you want to call it, dash underlined, and that's because that dependent is a weak entity. In the Chen-like ER diagram, we depict a weak entity with a double rectangle. So you will notice that the weak entity has a double rectangle. I'll move forward on the slides a little just to keep in parallel with ideas. And in the slide, we talk about, on slide 5, we talk about initially a department may be a multi-valued attribute, but then we would convert that once we realize that it's a weak entity, we convert it to a weak entity. And department becomes a weak entity. So on slide 6, we have an example of a store, and initially departments was a multi-valued attribute, and now department becomes a weak entity, as shown on slide 8. So, going to slide 11, the key of a weak entity is the key from the identifying entity plus its partial key. Well, we'll get to that when we get to the mappings, but basically the partial keys are shown by the dash underline. Okay, now talking about the structural constraints on the weak entities, so let's go back to page 175 of the book. Usually, or rather, weak entities must have full participation from the weak entity to the strong entity, but not necessarily from the strong entity to the weak entity. So if you look at page 175, there's a partial participation between the employee and the dependent, but there's a full participation between the dependent and the employee. So an employee may or may not have a dependent, but if there is a dependent, it has to depend on the employee. Weak entities, by their very definition or their very nature, means that there has to be full participation between the weak entity and its strong entity. And the cardinality is usually 1 to n. The cardinality is usually 1 to n because you can have one employee may have many dependents. So if we look at the next slide, with our same example of store and dependent, which we've depicted it in the same manner. Okay, now going to slide 14, it says, situations may exist when the weak entity may be connected to other relationships. So, on page 175, we show the weak entity connected to the strong entity, but the weak entity can also have other relationships. So if you look at figure 7.4 on page 177, you'll notice that there are two relationships between the employee and the automobile. The automobile is a weak entity, but it's only a weak entity in relation to the owns relationship. Notice the owns relationship is a double diamond relationship. The participation is a full participation. But notice that the drives relationship is not a double diamond relationship. So although there are two relationships there, owns and drive, only one of them is a weak relationship, and that is the owns relationship. And the other one is a regular relationship. Now, if you turn to figure 7.5, you will see another interesting relationship where you've got a person may own many pets. The pet is a weak relationship of person, but it is not a weak relationship of vet. The vet must treat many pets, but the pet is not a weak relationship of vet. Pet is only a weak relationship of person. So going to the next slide, a weak entity may be an owner of another weak entity. Look at figure 7.6. An employee may have many dependents, and in this case we've made it a must, where an employee must have a dependent. And the dependent may have more than one hobby. So employee is a weak entity, dependent is a weak entity of employee, and hobby is a weak entity of dependent. So a weak entity can also have another weak entity. So in summary, a weak entity can be related to other regular entities. A weak entity can have other weak entities dependent on it. A weak entity can have different kinds of relationships with different entities, and some of them may be regular and some of them may be weak. Okay, so if we are talking about the methodology that we were trying to develop, we modified step 3C. So if a new entity depends entirely on another entity, draw this as a weak entity. Double box. Participation is full and partial key is dash underlined. Step 4A, if an additional entity does not have a candidate key, draw it as a weak entity. The key. For each weak entity, for each entity, we do not assume that an attribute will be unique enough to identify individual entities without accompanying reference of the strong entity. And we'll show this with the mapping rules. So the mapping rules for weak entities. Create a new table for each weak entity. Include all atomic attributes of the weak entity. Include all atomic parts of the composite attributes of the weak entity. Include the primary key of the owner entity, and that's the most important thing. The primary key of the weak entity is the partial key of the weak entity plus the primary key of the owner. So, when you map a weak entity, the primary key of the weak entity is the primary key of the owner attached to the partial key of the weak entity. So if you turn to page 183 of your book, you will see where figure 7.3, the relationship between the employee and dependent, the employee being the strong entity and the dependent being its weak entity, is mapped. So the employee ID from the employee table is taken and included in the dependent table, and notice that it is full underlined in addition to the D-name attribute or the partial key of the dependent table. And so the primary key of the weak entity becomes, the primary key of dependent, the weak entity becomes employee ID, comma, D-name, which is the key of the owner plus its own key becomes the primary key of the weak entity. So with this, I hope you've understood the concept of weak entities. Basically, the weak entity would not exist if the dependent did not exist. So for example, in the employee dependent relationship, if the employee got fired from the company or left the company for whatever reason, there would be no reason to store the information on the dependent. That's why we say the dependent is dependent on the employee for its existence. So that is the concept of weak entities. With this, I end this chapter, and I hope this clarifies things a little bit more. Bye for now.